Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for just a moment. Or keep them open, it doesn't really matter. What I want you to do is imagine standing on a hill somewhere in the galaxy. Maybe it's an Imperial mining world, the kind of grey, smoke-stained place where the sky is the colour of bruised metal and the ground crunches underfoot with decades of industrial waste. Maybe it's a jungle world, dense and steaming, where bioluminescent insects drift through the canopy at night, like embers from a fire that never quite goes out. Or maybe it's a dead world altogether, cratered and cold, the kind of place where sound doesn't travel quite right, and you feel a wrongness in the air that you can't name but can't shake either. Now imagine you hear it, not see it, hear it first. A low vibration that starts in your chest before your ears even register the sound. A rumble, then a grinding, then a cacophony that builds and builds until the very ground beneath you begins to tremble. It isn't thunder. Thunder stops. This doesn't stop. It grows. And beneath that mechanical roar, beneath the exhaust belch of 1,000 badly maintained engines, beneath the squeal of poorly welded metal on metal, there is something else. A voice. Or rather, thousands of voices, tens of thousands of them, all of them bellowing the same sound, a word that isn't quite a word, but contains within it entire worlds of meaning. A sound that is equal parts war cry, prayer, statement of identity, and barely contained savage joy. And then you see them, cresting the ridge, spilling through the tree line, erupting from the craters in the earth. Green, so much green. A wall of muscled, scarred, grinning bodies, packed so tightly together that they seem less like individual creatures and more like a single living thing. A tide of flesh and iron, advancing not because anyone told it to, but because that is simply what it does, what it has always done, what it was made to do. These are the orcs, and in the grim darkness of the far future, they are the most numerous, most widespread, and arguably most successful species the galaxy has ever produced. Welcome back to Q on 40K. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to the deepest and most immersive explorations of the lore behind Warhammer 40,000, delivered in a way that feels less like a lecture and more like settling in beside a fire late at night and letting someone tell you a story you never quite expected to care about as much as you do. So get comfortable, breathe, and let's talk about what it actually means to live an orc's life. From the moment that first spore sinks into alien soil, all the way to the glorious, thunderous, magnificently chaotic end. Because the orcs are not simply a faction in a game. They are not merely cannon fodder for space marine heroics, or a convenient backdrop for military campaigns. They are, in their own way, one of the most fascinating, layered, and deeply strange civilizations in all of science fiction. Their biology alone reads like something from a fever dream written by a mycologist who had been dabbling too heavily in extraterrestrial fungi. Their society is brutal and egalitarian in ways that no human system of government has quite managed to replicate. Their technology works through mechanisms that shame every known law of physics. And their gods, they're strange, violent, indestructible, completely uninterested in your prayers, gods, are expressions of a kind of spiritual life that is as alien as anything you could dream up, and yet oddly, almost uncomfortably, relatable. We're going to travel through the entire arc of an orc's existence today, from the spore that drifts on alien winds before it ever finds soil, through the slow push of a new life clawing its way upward into daylight, through the battles and the hierarchy and the culture and the faith. We'll visit the workshops where mech boys build weapons that should not work, but undeniably do. We'll smell the fungus beer and hear the crunch of squig meat and feel the particular electric atmosphere of a settlement on the edge of something violent and wonderful. We'll climb the ranks from the smallest youth to the towering, war-scarred immensity of a war boss who has survived long enough to grow into something that barely fits through a standard doorframe. And if we're very patient and very quiet, which admittedly is not particularly orky, we might even glimpse something deeper. Something in the thunder of 10,000 voices, in the green light that bleeds through the warp whenever enough of them gather. Something that was old before humanity learned to use fire, and that will be old still when the last star burns out. So settle in, let the noise of everything else fade, and let's begin at the very beginning, which, for an orc, begins somewhere much older and stranger than you might expect. Section 2. Ancient Origins, the Krork and the Old Ones. Before there were orcs, there were Krork, and before there were Krork, there were the Old Ones. The Old Ones were, as far as anyone in the 41st millennium can tell, the first truly advanced spacefaring species the galaxy ever produced. They predated the Eldar. They predated humanity by margins so enormous that the number becomes meaningless. They were extraordinarily ancient, extraordinarily powerful, and extraordinarily good at two things in particular. First, navigating and exploiting the strange subdimension that humans would eventually call the warp. And second, the creation of life. Purposeful, engineered, carefully designed life. The Eldar themselves are often thought to be one of their creations, or at least one of the species they heavily influenced. And across the galaxy, there are signs of their long handiwork wherever you find races with unusual psychic potential and suspiciously deliberate biological architecture. The Old Ones lived during a period that the orcs themselves, in their oral traditions, call the War in Heaven. This wasn't a metaphor. It was a genuine, galaxy-spanning conflict fought between the Old Ones and their allies on one side, and the ancient enemy on the other, the Necrontyr, a species of beings who had stripped away their own flesh and poured their consciousness into bodies of living metal, becoming something new and terrible called the Necrons. The Necrons were guided and empowered by vast entities called Catan, or star gods, beings of immense power, who fed on the energy of stars and who regarded organic life with the casual, hungry contempt of things that have never needed anything and have no concept of want. Together, the Necrons and Catan were devastating. They swept across the galaxy, and the Old Ones, for all their power, were losing. It was from this desperate need that the Krork were born. The Old Ones were bioscientists of a caliber that makes the most advanced genetic engineering in the 41st millennium look like a child drawing with crayons. And so they did what brilliant engineers do when confronted with a problem that seems unsolvable by conventional means. They designed something specifically to solve it. They took the raw genetic material available to them and they crafted a warrior species. Not just warriors in the sense of creatures that were aggressive and physically powerful, though the Krork were certainly both of those things. They were warriors in the architectural sense. Every cell in their bodies, every protein in their biology, every hard-coded instinct buried in the depths of their nervous system, all of it pointed in one direction and one direction only. Combat. Escalating, self-sustaining, self-reinforcing, never-ending combat. What the Krork looked like in their original form is the subject of considerable speculation, since very few records of them survive, and those that do tend to come from sources with their own agendas. The Necrons, who were fighting them at the time, remember them as formidable opponents. The Eldari, whose own myths brush up against the edges of this period, remember the Krork as beings of surprising power, who were difficult to kill and even more difficult to discourage. The single most startling piece of physical evidence we have comes from the collections of Trazyn the Infinite, a Necron archaeologist of unusual habits, who keeps one of everything interesting he has ever encountered in stasis fields across his vast museum world. Among his exhibits, there is reportedly a Krork specimen, and that specimen stands 12 meters tall, clad in what is described as an exoskeleton of technology far more advanced than anything the modern orc race could build or even comprehend. 12 meters. For scale, a modern orc warboss, already a creature that stands around 3 meters tall, and looks roughly like if you took an entire rugby team, compressed them together, gave the result a very bad attitude and an industrial-grade jawline. A modern warboss fits inside that Krork the way an action figure fits inside a grown man's fist. The Krork of the War in Heaven was something else entirely. They were weapons the size of small buildings, wrapped in the most advanced technology their makers could produce, and they carried within them the same basic biological clockwork that still ticks in every orc you'll encounter 60 million years later. The most fascinating detail, and the one that carries the most weight for everything that follows, is this. The old ones didn't just make the Krorks strong, they made them adaptive. Specifically, they designed the Krork to grow more powerful in response to conflict. The larger the battle, the greater the threat, the more the Krork would escalate. Individual warriors would become physically larger, psychically potent, and technologically more capable as the scale of the war around them increased. In a galaxy-spanning conflict against near-indestructible robotic god-servants, this was not a design flaw, it was the point. You build a weapon that gets stronger the worse things get, and then you aim it at the worst thing you can find. The War in Heaven eventually ended, or at least receded. The details are lost in the fog of a history 60 million years removed from the present day. The old ones vanished. The great Krork Empire, which had spread across significant portions of the galaxy, also faded. What remained was a diminished people, cut off from whatever had made them so remarkable, gradually losing the extraordinary height and power and technological sophistication of their ancestors, settling, in the most literal sense, into something smaller, cruder, more immediate in its concerns. The Krork, over millions of years, became what we now call orcs. But here is the thing that matters, the thing that makes the blood run a little colder when you think about it properly. The Krork never truly disappeared. They became dormant. The old ones, when they built their warrior species, didn't build in a retirement plan, they built in a return clause. All the power, all the potential, all the biological machinery for that galaxy-spanning escalation, it's still there, buried in the genetic code of every orc alive, waiting. The orcs of the 41st millennium are not the final form of this species. They are what happens when that machinery runs on low power, when the wars are small and fragmented, and no single threat is enormous enough to trigger the full cascade. They are a species holding its breath, waiting for something big enough to fully wake up. There is a fragment of orc oral tradition, technically a vision experienced by the prophet Orc Gazgul Thraka and recounted in somewhat garbled form, that describes the peak of the Krork era. The passage speaks of the orcs getting larger as the fighting grew more intense, until even the smallest runts among them stood taller than the greatest warbosses of the present day. Huge, perfect, rippling with green light. Orcs as they were meant to be. And then the fighting stopped, and in the silence after the last great battle, without the war that had defined them, the orcs began to diminish. And eventually a new leader rose among the diminished ones, battered them back into something resembling order, and the cycle began again. Smaller this time, always smaller, but never finished. The orcs, in other words, are not a race in decline. They are a race awaiting a war large enough to call them back to what they once were. Section 3. Birth of an Orc, the Spore Cycle and Early Life. Understanding how an orc is born requires completely dismantling the assumptions that the word born brings with it. There is no mother, there is no father, there is no moment of conception, no gestation, no trembling first breath drawn in somebody's arms. The way orcs come into being is stranger and more ancient than any of that, and it says something profound about what they fundamentally are. At the most basic level, every orc is a spore. Throughout their lives, eating, fighting, breathing, bleeding, simply existing, orcs continuously release microscopic fungal spores into the environment around them. These spores drift on the wind, seep into the soil, cling to the hulls of ships, ride the currents of alien rivers, and generally spread with the patient, relentless thoroughness of nature, doing what nature does when it has enough time and enough ambition. But the most significant release happens at the moment of death. When an orc dies, it releases a final, enormous burst of spores, millions upon millions of them, a last, generous gift to whatever world is unfortunate enough to be the location of that death. In this way, every fallen orc is simultaneously an ending and a beginning. Those spores sink into the ground and begin a process that the imperial scholars of the Adeptus biologists have spent considerable effort trying to understand and considerably more effort trying to stop. Underground, the spores develop into something that doesn't have an easy parallel in human biology, a kind of living root network, a vast mat of fungal growth that essentially functions as a womb. This subterranean structure nourishes developing life. It feeds growing bodies. It transfers nutrients and biological signals through a web of mycelium that, in its own alien way, resembles the nervous system of something much larger than any individual organism. And from this underground nursery, life emerges. Not all at once, and not all of the same kind. The orcoid ecosystem, because the orcs are not a species in isolation, but an entire self-contained biome, follows a specific sequence, building itself up from the ground floor in layers, each species creating the conditions that allow the next to thrive. First come the squigs. We'll spend more time with these extraordinary creatures later, but for now it's enough to know that they are the simplest form of orcoid life, small, ferocious, and wildly diverse in their specific adaptations. Squigs are essentially the primary producers of the ecosystem, the bottom of the food web. They eat organic refuse, they breed fast, and they provide the raw material, food, medicine, tools, entertainment that the rest of the ecosystem needs. After the squigs come the snotlings. The smallest and most pathetic seeming of the orcoid races, snotlings stand barely half a meter tall and possess intelligence that hovers somewhere between a very determined dog and a clever one. But snotlings are fundamentally important because they have an extraordinary, almost instinctive affinity with fungus and with squigs. Left to their own devices, a population of snotlings will cultivate fungus patches with the enthusiasm of agricultural specialists who deeply love their work. They tend the squigs. They maintain the underground growing networks. They make themselves useful in ways that their physical inadequacy would otherwise suggest should be impossible. They are, in the structure of orcoid ecology, the farmers, the groundskeepers, the unseen foundation on which everything else rests. Then come the Gretchen, smarter, faster, more cunning, and considerably more aware of their own misery than the snotlings below them on the social ladder. The Gretchen are the builders, the workers, the craftsmen of early settlements. Wherever a population of snotlings has established a functioning fungus garden and a reasonable squig population, Gretchen will eventually appear and begin doing what Gretchen do: constructing shelters, scavenging useful materials, trading, scheming, building the infrastructure that the final arrival needs to thrive. And then, last of all, the biggest ones push up through the earth. The emergence of a new orc is not a subtle event. The new being has been developing underground, fed by the fungal network, growing with the patient determination of something that was always supposed to be large. When it finally breaks the surface, It does so head first, shoving the last of the soil aside with the kind of strength that suggests it's been annoyed by the delay for some time. Newly emerged orcs, called youths, are already several feet tall. They already know how to fight. They already understand, at some deep biological level coded directly into the fungal portions of their neurology, the basics of how orc society works. They emerge knowing who is in charge, knowing what weapons are for, knowing that the biggest, strongest voice is the one worth listening to, and that if no such voice exists nearby, perhaps they should become it. This pre-installed knowledge is one of the most remarkable things about the orc species, and it deserves some careful attention. Orcs do not go to school. There are no apprenticeships in the conventional sense, no prolonged period of study, no elder sitting a young one down and explaining patiently how the world works. A mech boy doesn't learn how to build an engine from a teacher. The understanding is in his genes, encoded in the fungal portions of his biology by the old ones 60 million years ago, and passed down through every generation since. When that mech boy picks up a piece of scrap metal and starts working on it, he's accessing a racial memory so old it predates human civilization by geological epochs. The pain boy doesn't study medicine. His hands already know what to do. The knowledge is there, waiting to be triggered, like a seed waiting for warmth and water to know it's time to grow. This matters because it means that an orc doesn't need years of education and social development to become functional. An orc is, from the moment it clears the last of the soil from its face and stands squinting in whatever passes for daylight on whatever world it finds itself on, essentially ready. Ready to contribute, ready to fight, ready to begin the process of becoming as large and dominant and extraordinary as its particular luck and ferocity and stubbornness will allow. The speed of this is staggering compared to the long, vulnerable childhood of the human species. No one is going to tell this thing not to run with scissors. It was born holding scissors. That said, a youth doesn't emerge as a fully formed orc boy, and those first months are a kind of accelerated adolescence that is uniquely orcish in its character. The youth must find a mob. This is not optional. An isolated orc is a miserable and eventually doomed creature. Not because it lacks survival skills, but because everything about its neurology has been tuned for collective existence. The vibration of other orcs nearby isn't just pleasant. It is, in some sense, necessary. The gestalt field, the psychic resonance that all orcs generate, and that we'll explore in much greater depth later, grows stronger with proximity and numbers. A lone orc is diminished in ways it probably couldn't articulate, but can certainly feel. So the youth finds a mob, and in finding a mob, it finds its first real education, not in skills or knowledge, which it already possesses in coded form, but in the more complex curriculum of who it actually is. Because orc society, for all its apparent chaos, has structure. And that structure is the first thing a young orc must learn to navigate. It's worth dwelling a moment longer on the underground stage, because it's genuinely one of the stranger things in all of 40,000's very strange biology. The fungal network that nurtures developing orcs isn't passive, it's responsive, it communicates. Through mechanisms that Imperial researchers have struggled to model with any confidence, the underground network appears to detect the conditions on the surface and adjust the development of the organisms it's nurturing accordingly. If the surface is experiencing large-scale conflict, the spores develop faster, as though the network is trying to get reinforcements to the fight. If conditions are peaceful, if a planet has been cleansed of orcs, and the underground networks have gone years without sensing the vibration of large gatherings above, the development process slows to something closer to a standby mode, conserving resources, waiting for a signal. This is part of why eradicating orcs from a planet is such a nightmare. You can win the surface engagement decisively and completely. You can hunt down every last orc above ground, burn out every settlement, purge every cave and ruin and underground structure. And then you establish a colony and 50 years later, someone starts reporting unusual fungal growth at the edges of the fields. And 10 years after that, there are sightings of small, green, agile creatures in the forests. And 15 years after that, the first orc boy crawls out of the ground, in the middle of what used to be farmland, stands up, looks around with an expression that manages to combine complete confusion with absolute confidence, and immediately tries to hit the nearest person. The surface battle was never the war. The underground network was the war, and you can't fight the underground network because you'd have to sterilize the entire planetary crust to the depth of several meters, and by the time you've done that, you've generally created a different set of problems. The other element of the emergence worth noting is what happens between sibling orcs, because that's essentially what they are. Orcs that emerge from the same fungal network at approximately the same time, from spores released by the same population of predecessor orcs, are biologically related in a way that isn't quite family in any human sense, but carries some of the same weight. They share the same base genetic material, they were nourished by the same underground structures. Their psychic resonance, when they generate it, has a particular harmonic quality with each other that is subtly different from the resonance between orcs of different biological lineages. Does this create loyalty? In the specific, unconditional way that human siblings can develop loyalty, not reliably. Orc hierarchies are determined by size and success, and the fact that someone shares your underground nursery doesn't exempt them from getting cuffed on the skull if they're smaller than you and in the way. But it does create a kind of low-level background familiarity, a recognition signal that experienced orcs can apparently detect, and that subtly influences the dynamics of mob formation. Orcs that emerge together tend, all else being equal, to end up in the same mobs. Not because they're sentimental about it, because they recognize each other in the deep way that the psychic field makes possible. And that recognition is its own kind of gravity. Section 4. The body of a born warrior. Orc biology. Before we can fully understand how an orc lives, it helps enormously to understand what an orc is made of. Because the body of an orc is not simply a large, green, violent human. It is something genuinely extraordinary, a feat of biological engineering so elegant and so specifically optimized that even the most advanced imperial xenobiologists, looking at it with centuries of accumulated knowledge, cannot fully account for everything it does. Start with the skin. That green coloration, so distinctive and so universal, is not simply a matter of pigmentation. The greenness is structural. The orc's skin contains a form of algae, or something functionally equivalent to algae, that permeates their cellular makeup at a level so fundamental that removing it would require rebuilding the organism from scratch. This algae does something extraordinary. It photosynthesizes. Not efficiently, not at the level of a plant in full sunlight, but enough to matter. An orc can, in the most literal biological sense, derive some of its energy requirements directly from light. This has implications that cascade through everything about how orc armies and communities operate. Supply lines for food exist in orc society, but they are vastly less critical than in human warfare. An orc can go longer without eating than a human. It requires less food per unit of body mass. And in situations where food is genuinely scarce, the green ones have a built-in advantage that their non-photosynthesizing enemies fundamentally lack. The bones are the next remarkable thing. Thick, extraordinarily thick, not just compared to human bone, but compared to nearly any species of comparable size anywhere in the biological literature. The core of an orc's skeletal structure is dense enough to absorb high-velocity impacts without fracturing. Impacts that would shatter human bone as completely as glass. And within those bones, replacing what would be conventional marrow in a human skeleton, is a spongy fungal matter that contributes to the structural strength while also performing the biological functions that marrow would normally handle, producing the cellular components that circulate through the bloodstream and keep the creature functioning. That blood is worth mentioning too. Orc blood is green, which surprises no one given everything else about the creature. But the reason it's green is remarkable. It contains an extraordinarily high concentration of chlorophyll, the same compound that makes plants green and that is fundamental to photosynthesis. Beyond that, orc blood is full of fungal organisms. The blood is essentially a flowing culture medium, keeping alive a community of organisms that perform tasks in the orc body that most complex animals have dedicated organs to handle. The liver equivalent, the kidney equivalent, the spleen, the pancreas. The orcs have something broadly analogous to these organs, but the heavy lifting in terms of biochemical processing is done by this internal fungal ecosystem. The result is that many of the conditions that would fatally damage a human, things that would destroy a vital organ and kill through organ failure, simply don't apply to an orc in the same way. You can't kill an orc by targeting its liver, because its liver is not a discrete, vital, non-replaceable structure. It's a community of organisms distributed throughout the body cavity, and removing some of them just means the rest work harder. This is why orcs are so extraordinarily resilient. The famous example, repeated by xenobiologists and horrified Imperial soldiers in equal measure, is the orc's head. An orc's head, severed cleanly from its body, does not immediately die. The head will continue to function, to think, to speak, to express opinions, to be very angry about what just happened, for some time after separation. Orc pain boys, the species equivalent of surgeons, perform head reattachment as a routine procedure. The head and body, if brought back into proximity within a certain time frame, can be rejoined and both parties will continue functioning. This is not magic. It is a consequence of what the body is built from, of the fungal tissue that maintains function through the kind of distributed, redundant system that no human engineer would design because no human engineer would believe it could work. The muscles are another chapter in this biology of excess. Orc muscle fiber is denser and more mechanically efficient than the human equivalent by a significant margin. An average orc boy, a common-as-muck frontline grunt with no particular distinction, is stronger than any unaugmented human alive. Not stronger in the way that a very strong human is stronger than a less strong human. Stronger in a categorically different league, the kind of strength that is a matter of a different kind of physical architecture rather than simply more of the same. An orc boy can tear apart materials, lift objects, and deliver blows that no human without artificial augmentation can match. And orc knobs, who are larger and have more combat experience, are proportionally stronger still. And war bosses, who are the largest and most seasoned orcs, operate in a realm of physical capability that begins to overlap with the most powerful warriors in the setting: the Space Marines, the Custodian Guard, the Primarchs themselves. There is one more aspect of orc biology that deserves its own moment of attention, and it is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of all. Orcs do not have a complex immune system in the way that humans do. They don't need one. The fungal components of their biology handle infection and disease with an efficiency that makes conventional immune responses look slow and fragile. An orc can wade through environments that would kill a human inside of hours, environments saturated with toxins, pathogens, radiation, industrial waste, and emerge having shrugged the experience off the way you or I might shrug off a mild inconvenience. Wounds that would be septic death sentences in a human are not merely survivable for an orc, but sometimes don't even interrupt whatever it was doing. And then there is the growth factor, the single most important fact about orc biology, the one that makes them unique among all the species of the galaxy in this particular way. Orcs do not stop growing. Ever. For as long as an orc continues to fight and win, for as long as it continues to be respected and feared and acknowledged as powerful by the orcs around it, it continues to get larger. The mechanisms behind this are not fully understood, even by the most diligent Imperial researchers. But the process involves something fundamental about the relationship between the orc's social status, its psychological state, specifically its sense of dominance, and the activity of whatever passes for growth hormones in that extraordinary biology. A successful orc is a growing orc. A victorious orc grows faster. An orc that has won enough battles for its name to carry genuine fear starts to become something that no longer quite fits in the same rooms as its fellows. A standard orc boy stands about as tall as a large human male, perhaps a bit more. A nob, one of the semi-elite mid-ranking warriors, is noticeably larger. A war boss, a creature that has fought its way to the top of an entire tribe through nothing but violence and force of personality, can reach 3 meters or more in height, with the kind of physical mass that makes modern main battle tanks seem like a reasonable foe rather than an obviously stupid idea to challenge. And the historical record suggests that these limits are not the limits of the species. They're simply the limits of what current-era wars are large enough to produce. Section 5. Growing up green, from youth to boy. So the youth has emerged from the earth. It has found a mob. And now the real education begins. There's a quality to early orc life that is surprisingly, almost uncomfortably recognizable to human observation. Not in the details, but in the emotional texture. The youth is small, and in orc society, small means vulnerable in a very immediate and practical sense. Not vulnerable in the way that a human child is vulnerable, needing protection and care and careful nurturing. Vulnerable in the sense that any orc large enough to do so will feel perfectly free to cuff it on the skull, steal its food, set it on errands it doesn't want to run, and generally make its life miserable in ways that range from mildly inconvenient to genuinely dangerous. This is not considered cruelty in orc culture. This is considered training. The youth that survives this period, that learns to dodge and duck and find its feet, and eventually, gradually, begin to hit back with some success. That youth is becoming an orc. The one that doesn't, well, that one feeds something else. The social hierarchy of an orc mob is determined by one thing and one thing only, and that thing is not wealth or birth or cleverness or moral authority. It is size. Specifically, it is the size that comes from fighting and winning. Bigger orcs have beaten more other orcs. They have demonstrated, through the most direct and unambiguous mechanism possible, that they are superior. This creates a social order that is paradoxically both completely rigid and completely fluid. Rigid in the sense that no one questions the legitimacy of size as a measure of status. Fluid in the sense that the status of any individual orc can change as rapidly as it can grow. Today's youth that eats well, fights often, and wins more than it loses is tomorrow's boy. And today's boy is tomorrow's knob, if it's lucky and vicious enough. The youth period lasts roughly a year by most accounts, though the exact duration varies with the intensity of activity. An orc that finds itself in an active war zone during its first year of life, that spends its days surrounded by the psychic energy of thousands of fighting orcs and has regular access to combat experience, will mature faster than one that emerges on a quiet world and spends its youth doing relatively little. This connects to the growth mechanism. The psychic field that all orcs generate grows stronger when more of them are gathered and when they're doing what they were built to do. That field apparently has a direct effect on physical development, meaning that growing up in a large and active warband is, in orcish terms, like growing up with the best possible nutrition. By the time a youth has grown enough to be considered a boy, and this is a social transition rather than a formal one, occurring when enough of the orcs around it have updated their assessment, it has already fought many dozens of times. It has already started to find the particular configuration of combat that suits it. The orc that loved the brawling free-for-all of up-close fighting, the one that was always pushing toward the thickest melee rather than hanging back, is probably headed toward being a standard boy or eventually a knob.
You know, the more I dig into orc lore specifically, the more I find myself genuinely impressed by how much thought went into them underneath all the comedy. Like, on the surface, they're the joke faction. Loud, green, crashes vehicles into things. But then you pull the thread, and there's this 60 million year history, this fully functioning ecosystem, this psychic field that bends a reality based on collective belief. And I think what gets me most is that they might genuinely be the most content species in the entire setting. No existential threat, no empire crumbling under its own weight, just pure, complete alignment between what they are and what they do. In a universe this relentlessly bleak, there's something almost peaceful about that. But anyway, that's my two teeth. Let's get back to it.
One of the heavy infantry that form the backbone of every orc warband. The one that showed an unusual instinct for how engines work, that kept being found poking around the insides of vehicles with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wants to understand the mechanism. That one is beginning to manifest the latent genetic knowledge of a mech boy, and the other orcs will start treating it differently. A mixture of irritation, respect, and the practical recognition that someone needs to fix the bikes. The question of combat and what it means to orcs deserves to be approached with some care here, because it's easy to reduce it to a caricature. Yes, orcs love fighting. Yes, every interaction between orcs involves some element of physical dominance testing, even in peacetime. But the nuance is that orcs don't experience combat the way humans experience violence. Humans who are constitutionally violent, who enjoy inflicting harm and dominating others, are generally considered in human society to be expressing some form of pathology. The violence is a symptom. There is something wrong with the wiring. For orcs, this is not the case at all. The fighting is not a displacement of something else, not an outlet for frustration or a compensation for inadequacy. It is simply what the creature is for, in the same way that a bird is made to fly or a fish is made to swim. An orc fighting is an orc fulfilling its biological purpose. There is no pathology here. There is only an animal doing exactly what its designer intended, in a universe that designed the animal knowing full well what it was creating. What this means in practice is that young orcs fighting amongst themselves in the settlement, which is constant and ongoing and completely normal, is not a sign of social dysfunction. It's training. It's status calibration. It's the mechanism by which the hierarchy updates itself as individuals grow and develop. And it's genuinely enjoyable to the participants in a way that should not be confused with human sadism or aggression. An orc that has just won a brawl is not triumphant in the way a bully is triumphant. It is satisfied in the way that an athlete is satisfied. The satisfaction of having done the thing you were built to do and having done it well. And the orc that lost, it's already thinking about how it'll do better next time. The psychic environment of the mob, the collective resonance of all those green bodies radiating their communal field, helps with this. Defeat in the orcish psyche does not carry the sting of shame that it carries in human cultures. It carries the information value of data. You lost. You know why you lost. Now you don't lose that way again. There is a famous observation by one of the few human scholars who spent any meaningful time embedded in a relatively non-hostile orc community, a peculiar arrangement that came about through circumstances too complicated to go into here, who noted that young orcs display a learning curve in combat that is genuinely impressive. Not impressive in the prodigy sense, where a single individual shows extraordinary early ability. Impressive in the systematic sense. An orc that loses a particular kind of fight will specifically improve its performance against that particular kind of fight in subsequent encounters, with a speed of adaptation that suggests the learning is happening at a level more fundamental than conscious strategic analysis. The orc isn't studying its mistakes. The mistakes are being metabolized, incorporated directly into the biological pattern of combat instinct that the creature runs on. It's the difference between a human strategist reviewing footage to understand what went wrong, and a biological system receiving corrective feedback and updating itself accordingly. This adaptive quality is one of the reasons that simply applying the same counter-tactic to orcs repeatedly is a losing strategy in the long run. In the short term, yes, a specific weakness exploited consistently will yield results. But the orcs exposed to that exploitation will, given time, stop having that weakness. Not through any formal tactical education or leadership directive, through the simple biological process of living creatures adapting to their environment. Except that the orc's environment is combat, and it adapts to combat the way other species adapt to drought or disease or predation, faster than you'd expect, more fundamentally than a purely behavioral adaptation should allow. As the boy begins to establish itself in the mob, it starts accumulating the markers of status that matter in orc society. The first and most important of these is, again, size. But close behind is equipment. Orcs acquire their weaponry through several means. They can buy it with teeth, the tooth-based currency we'll explore in detail shortly. They can scavenge it from battlefields. They can steal it from other orcs. Or they can commission it from a mech boy if they have the resources and the standing to do so. The quality and quantity of an orc's weapons say something about that orc's status in a very direct way. A boy with a decent shooter and a sharp chopper is doing reasonably well. A boy with a heavily modified weapon, covered in extra components that may or may not contribute to its function, but certainly increase its visual impressiveness, is doing better. A knob with a power claw and a combat interface welded directly into its skull is communicating something very clear about where it sits in the hierarchy. The relationship between orc boys and their weapons is not simply functional. There is an emotional dimension to it that, once you know it's there, is difficult to unsee. An orc's weapons are its, in a possessive sense that carries genuine meaning. The modifications and customizations that orcs make to their weapons are not just attempts to improve performance, though they often do improve performance through mechanisms we'll discuss later. They are expressions of identity. The particular arrangement of components on a shooter, the specific grip modification on a chopper, the additional spikes welded onto the front of a vehicle, these are statements. This is who I am. This is what I have made mine. In a society that has very little concept of private property in any formal sense, where the biggest person takes what it wants from the smallest person as a matter of course, the weapons that an orc has earned or built or modified are among the few things that carry genuine personal attachment. Section 6. The Orc Settlement. Daily life, teeth, and commerce. Now that we have an orc who is past its youth years and has begun to establish itself in a mob, let's take a step back and look at where it actually lives. Because while the image of the orc is always the battlefield, most of an orc's life is spent not in battle, or at least not in formal warfare, but in and around the settlement. The ramshackle, sprawling, perpetually under construction, fungus-smelling, aggressively noisy home base that forms the centre of orc communal life. Orc settlements are not beautiful. This is the polite way of putting it. The less polite way is that an orc settlement looks like the aftermath of an explosion inside a scrapyard, except that the explosion is ongoing and the scrapyard has opinions, and they're mostly about fighting. Every structure is built from whatever materials were available, assembled with the particular genius of creatures that understand mechanical function instinctively, but have no interest whatsoever in aesthetics or standardization. Walls are a mix of salvaged metal, poured concrete equivalent substances, compacted fungal matter, and anything else that was nearby when someone needed something to lean against something else. Roofs are whatever was flat and could be thrown on top. The overall impression is of a place that has been building and rebuilding itself continuously for as long as anyone can remember. Each layer of construction sitting somewhat incompetently on the bones of the last. The smell is significant. Orc settlements have a particular olfactory character that human observers consistently describe as a combination of machine oil, rotting vegetation, cooking meat, burning fuel, and something else that doesn't map onto any human reference point, the living fungus smell of the ecosystem that underlies everything orcish. A thick, earthy, slightly sweet odor that clings to the air around any large gathering of greenskins. This is partly the fungus itself, which grows enthusiastically wherever orcs live, and partly the squigs in the cesspits, and partly the orcs themselves, whose biology produces compounds that don't correspond to anything the human nose has evolved to categorize. In the center of the settlement, or rather, in whatever location has established itself as central through the accumulated force of habit and the presence of the most important people, is the heart of orc social life. The place where orcs gather to eat, to trade, to fight, to boast about fighting, to plan fights, and to argue at length about whose fights were better and who was responsible for this morning's particular brawl. There is no formal central hall or meeting place. The architecture of the settlement is too anarchic for that kind of intentional design. But there is always a gathering point. You can find it by following the noise. Commerce in orc settlements runs on teeth. The capitalization is justified because orc teeth are not simply teeth in the biological sense. They are the fundamental unit of an economic system that is, when you examine it carefully, surprisingly functional, and in some respects, more sophisticated than many human monetary systems. Here's the core mechanism. Orcs continuously grow new teeth throughout their lives, replacing old ones in a manner similar to a shark. Not one or two at a time, but in ongoing cycles of replacement. The teeth themselves are large, dense, ivory-like structures with real physical properties. They retain a sharp edge when properly prepared. They can cut through metal. In powdered form, mixed with certain fungi, they have medicinal properties. And they're a natural, species-wide resource that every orc produces and every other orc recognizes as valuable. The brilliance of the teeth system, which the old ones may or may not have deliberately designed, and which orcs certainly didn't consciously engineer as a monetary policy, is in its built-in anti-hoarding mechanism. Orc teeth degrade over time. Left alone, they gradually decompose. This means you cannot accumulate vast stores of teeth and sit on them. The longer you hold them, the less they're worth, because the physical object itself is deteriorating. This keeps the currency in circulation. It creates economic pressure to spend rather than save, which keeps trade moving. It prevents the accumulation of extreme wealth disparities in the way that most monetary systems inevitably create. Yes, some orcs, the bad moons particularly, are richer than others, but no orc can parlay a windfall into permanent generational wealth. The teeth will rot. You'd better spend them. The prices, as far as can be determined, are broadly consistent across orc settlements throughout the galaxy. One tooth will buy you a decent squig pie and a tankard of fungus beer, the standard meal and drink combination of orc daily life. A bag of teeth will get you a basic vehicle, maybe a cheap war buggy. An impressive, customized battle wagon, the kind of armored transport that a serious war boss would want to ride into battle, can cost hundreds of teeth. And at the very top of the market, the kind of custom weapons and armor that elite orcs commission from the best mech boys represent an investment of teeth that most ordinary boys will never accumulate in their entire lives. The food of the orc settlement deserves a moment because it's a window into the orcoid ecosystem in action. The primary food source is squig in various preparations. Squig on a stick, roasted over a fire. Squig pie, filled with whatever parts of the squig were available, and enclosed in something that functions like pastry when you bake it long enough. Squig meat dried and preserved for travel. Squig stew, squig soup. Raw squig for those who prefer the direct approach. There are also the fungi that snotlings cultivate, great spreading patches of various species, some edible, some medicinal, some both, and some that produce interesting psychological effects when consumed in sufficient quantities. Fungus beer is the universal beverage of Orc civilization, a thick, murky, fermented drink with an alcohol content that would stagger a human, but merely takes the edge off an Orc's general hyperactivity. The brew boys who produce it are respected craftspeople in their own right, and a particularly well-regarded batch of fungus beer can be its own form of social currency. Daily life in the settlement, between campaigns, has a rhythm that is not as chaotic as it first appears. There are things that need doing, and they get done, not because anyone assigned them or drew up a rota, but because the social hierarchy creates a natural labour distribution. The snotlings tend the fungus gardens and the squig pens. The Gretchen do the construction work, the maintenance, the running of errands, the hauling and fetching and scurrying that keeps the physical infrastructure of the settlement functional. The mech boys work in their shops, building and repairing and tinkering and arguing passionately with their assistants about whether a particular configuration of components is or isn't going to work. The pain boys run their establishments, and we'll discuss those in some detail shortly, because an Orc medical practice is an experience that deserves its own dedicated description. And the boys themselves do what boys do, which is mostly a rotating schedule of low-stakes brawling, gambling on various outcomes, eating large quantities of squig-based food, maintaining their weapons, boasting about past fights, and planning future ones. One activity that deserves special mention is the squig eating contest, which is to Orc culture what a sporting event is to human culture. A broadly social, broadly competitive activity that allows status to be established and displayed without the specific, potentially lethal focus of a formal duel. Squig eating contests work exactly as described. Orcs compete to consume the largest number of squigs in a given time, or the largest squigs, or the most dangerous squigs. The face-biter squig, which is essentially a snapping fanged mouth on legs, and which is known for its tendency to bite back with considerable enthusiasm, is a particularly prestigious competition item. An Orc that can eat a face-biter raw while it's still trying to take the Orc's face off demonstrates a particular kind of nonchalance that the crowd respects enormously. Vehicle races are another fixture of settlement life, particularly in communities with a strong evil sun's presence. The vehicles involved are, as a rule, barely roadworthy by any objective standard. They are built from salvaged parts, assembled with the enthusiastic imprecision of creatures that believe very strongly in their own technical competence and who don't always have the knowledge to match. They explode occasionally. They crash frequently. This is part of the entertainment. The crowd watching the race is genuinely uncertain whether the competitors will finish the course. And this uncertainty, who's going to make it, who's going to go over the edge, whose engine is going to catch fire this time, is precisely what makes it worth watching. And through all of this, the teeth flow. An Orc with something to sell sets up at whatever serves as a market stall in the settlement, usually a flat surface and the willingness to stand next to it looking aggressive. And the transactions happen. Mech boys offer custom work. Gretchen traders sell things they almost certainly stole. Pain boys advertise their services with the confidence of practitioners whose surgical record is, by any objective measure, quite alarming, but who have a very effective argument in the form of being very large and easily annoyed. It is loud and chaotic and violent, and alive in a way that many human markets would struggle to match. The language of Orc commerce is worth a brief examination because it says something illuminating about Orc society more broadly. Orc communication is a blunt instrument in the best possible sense. There are no euphemisms in Orc trade. There are no polite fictions, no diplomatic softening of hard realities. If something costs more than you have, you're told so, often with a physical demonstration of why the current owner believes their property is worth more than you can offer. If a mech's work isn't good enough, the customer says so, and the mech either accepts the criticism or demonstrates, physically, why the customer's assessment is wrong. This system of price discovery, while brutal, is at least honest. There is no advertising in the modern human sense, no attempt to make something seem more attractive or more valuable than it actually is, because any orc attempting such a deception would be exposed almost immediately by the straightforwardness of every other participant in the transaction. The Gretchen economy that exists beneath and alongside the main orc economy deserves its own acknowledgement because it is, in its own way, remarkably sophisticated. The Gretchen have established something close to a black market that operates entirely within the cracks and margins of orc social structure. Individual Gretchen who have managed to accumulate a small pool of teeth, usually through the combination of careful service, strategic hiding, and the enterprise of running small side businesses like food selling or bet-taking, operate networks of trade that extend across settlements and sometimes between warbands. Gretchen information networks are particularly valuable. Because the Gretchen are physically small and socially invisible to most senior orcs, they can go places and hear things that larger creatures miss, and information in orc society, who's planning to challenge whom, which war boss is weakening, which mech has just produced something that might actually work, has a real and immediate value. The relationship between the orc social structure and the Gretchen who serve within it is complicated in ways that a simple slave and master framing doesn't quite capture. Yes, Gretchen are at the bottom. Yes, they are kicked, stolen from, used as shields, deployed as expendable assets in situations where orcs don't want to risk a more valuable body, and generally treated with the casual indifference of beings who regard them as roughly equivalent to a useful piece of furniture that can be directed to carry things. But the Gretchen have developed, over countless generations of this treatment, a kind of resilient practicality about their position that is admirable in its own strange way. They don't seethe with resentment in the way that an enslaved human would. They don't organize uprisings with any frequency. Mostly, they find a comfortable corner, do what they're told while doing as much as possible on the side for their own benefit, and navigate the enormous, violent, indifferent world of the orcs around them with a rat-like cunning that is, arguably, its own form of success. There is a group called the Rebel Grots, Gretchen who have had enough and actually organized resistance. But they are the exception, and their rebellions tend to be short-lived, not because the orcs crush them with overwhelming force, though they do, but because most Gretchen look at the rebellion, look at the obvious consequences, and conclude that the comfortable corner and the side business is a better deal than the alternative. Section 7. The Specialists, Odd Boys, and the Roles They Play. No examination of what it means to be an orc can be complete without spending serious time on the odd boys, the specialists, the unusual ones, the orcs who emerged from the earth with a different kind of genetic pre-programming than the standard boy, and who fill the roles that pure combat excellence alone cannot fill. The odd boys are not just important to orc society, they are, in the deepest sense, why the orc species has lasted 60 million years and shows absolutely no sign of slowing down. The original designers, the old ones, if you accept that origin theory, apparently understood that a species dedicated entirely to combat would need to be capable of sustaining itself. You need engineers to build weapons. You need surgeons to patch warriors back together. You need something to handle the psychic pressures that come with large gatherings of beings, generating a collective field of warp energy. These needs were therefore coded directly into the genetic structure of the species, ensuring that wherever orcs gathered in sufficient numbers, the specialists would emerge to meet the need. Not because anyone told them to, because their biology made them. The mech boy, also known as a mechaniac or simply a mech, is perhaps the most externally visible of the odd roles because the products of his work are everywhere in orc society. Every vehicle, every weapon, every piece of armor, every power generator, every communication system, every structure with anything mechanical in it. All of it flows from the workshops and the restless, never still hands of the mech boys. And the remarkable thing is how they do it. A human engineer learns through study and practice. A mech boy knows. Not everything, and not immediately. The knowledge unlocks as the individual develops, as the fungal genetic information is translated into lived understanding. But when a young mech boy picks up a mechanical component, something in the deep architecture of its mind registers what the component is and what it does in a way that has nothing to do with prior experience. It is ancestral knowledge, the accumulated understanding of the Krork engineers of 60 million years ago, compressed and stored in the genomic equivalent of a biological archive and distributed through every mech boy born since. The mech boy doesn't derive first principles. It remembers them, even if it couldn't articulate where the knowledge came from. This is why Orc technology works, or rather, this is part of why it works. We'll discuss the psychic elements separately. But the mech boy's intuitive understanding is real and sophisticated, even when the output looks like a nightmare assembled from a skip. Inside the apparent chaos of an Orc weapon or vehicle, there is actual engineering, actual function. The gun shoots because a mech boy with genuine mechanical intuition built it to shoot. The vehicle moves because someone with an instinctive understanding of propulsion systems put it together. The fact that it looks like an explosion in a hardware store doesn't mean it doesn't work. It means the builder had different aesthetic priorities than you, which is a very different thing. The Mech Boy workshop is a place of constant noise and activity, and a very particular smell. The combination of machine oil, often extracted fresh from oil squigs by apprentices who would rather be doing literally anything else, burning metal, and that sweet fungal undertone that permeates everything Orcish. Mech Boys work with a focused intensity that is unusual for their species, surrounded by stacks of components that have been, are being, or will be incorporated into projects in various stages of completion. Their assistants, usually Gretchen or young orcs who have demonstrated enough mechanical instinct to be useful, hover around the edges, handing over components on request and trying not to get hit when their assessment of what is needed turns out to be wrong. The Big Mech is the pinnacle of this cast, a mech boy who has survived long enough to grow large enough and skilled enough to produce works of genuine wonder. Big Mechs build custom force fields, devices that generate a flickering energy barrier capable of turning aside incoming fire. They build the shock attack gun, a weapon that functions by channeling warp space to teleport projectiles, usually snotlings who are the closest to ammunition that is expendable, numerous, and too simple to understand that being loaded into a device that opens a wormhole is not in their best interests, directly inside armored targets. A Big Mech may, on occasion, produce something truly extraordinary. A stomper, a building-sized walking war machine that functions as both weapons platform and sacred object. Built in what the Mech Boy will insist is the image of Gork, or Mork, and that does, in its own ramshackle way, tend to terrify everyone who isn't inside it. The Pain Boy is something else entirely, and spending time in a Pain Boy's establishment requires, frankly, a certain kind of prepared mind. Imagine if you combined a surgeon, a butcher, an enthusiastic experimenter, a Frankenstein figure, and someone whose bedside manner was specifically calibrated to convey that the distinction between patient and subject is largely administrative. That is the Pain Boy, or Mad Doc, as they are sometimes called. Their specific genetic inheritance is an understanding of biology, of Orc biology specifically, that allows them to perform surgical interventions that would be miraculous if they were performed with any greater precision or care. As it is, they're still miraculous, just also terrifying. A Pain Boy can reattach a severed limb and have it working within a reasonable time frame. A Pain Boy can replace a lost arm with a mechanical one of their own construction, called a cyborg enhancement, that will perform the arm's basic functions and also, possibly, do other things that the original arm couldn't do, like shoot small rockets or produce an unexpectedly forceful grip. A painboy can remove bullets, set bones, drain infected wounds, and deal with the kind of traumatic battlefield injuries that would kill any less absurdly resilient species. Whether they do these things correctly, whether the patient gets what they came in for, whether the correct limb is treated and the correct organ is addressed, these are not guaranteed outcomes. There are stories of orcs who went to a painboy to have an arm fixed and emerged with their legs swapped. There are stories of painboys who added entirely unrequested modifications mid-surgery because the process seemed like it was going well and they had a spare component lying around. The painboy will express complete confidence in these outcomes. The painboy will claim the result is better. The painboy may actually be right. The most elevated painboys are called pain bosses, and these individuals sometimes lead groups of their own, collections of cyborg warriors who have been so extensively modified by the painboy's attentions that they are more metal than flesh, and who consequently seem to have developed a loyalty to the entity responsible for their continued, if significantly altered, existence. The specific relationship between a painboy and their patients is one of the genuinely unique social dynamics in orc culture. Most orc social bonds are horizontal, relationships between roughly equivalent beings negotiated through strength and competition. The painboy introduces a vertical dimension that has no equivalent elsewhere. The orc that is vulnerable in the painboy's care, that has temporarily surrendered the physical dominance that normally determines all things in orc society, and that must trust, to the extent that trust is a concept that operates in an orc psyche, that the painboy won't do something inadvisable with the opportunity. Orcs in a painboy's care cannot fight back. They cannot assert dominance. They are, for the duration of the procedure, entirely at the mercy of a being that they know is eccentric, experimental, and not fully invested in the outcome matching the patient's expectations. And yet, they go. They go because the alternative is going without the bionics that could make them larger and more fearsome, without the treatment that keeps them functioning after injuries that should have been fatal, without the edge that a painboy's enhancements can provide in the endless competition for status. They go because the calculus of risk, even when one side of the equation involves a painboy with a syringe squig and a worrying look in their eye, comes out in favor of the attempt. This willingness to accept vulnerability for the sake of future advantage is, actually, a form of long-term thinking that you don't normally associate with the orcs, and the fact that it emerges specifically in the context of medical treatment says something interesting about where the pragmatic side of the orc mind lives. The orc language that mechboys use among themselves is worth a mention here, because it represents something genuinely bizarre in the orc cultural picture. In everyday settings, orc speech is exactly what you'd expect. Loud, simple, direct, full of specific vocabulary for fighting and weapons and food, but somewhat sparse on nuance. But mechboys, when they are discussing technical matters with other mechboys, shift into something that observers have described as a different mode entirely. The same voice, the same accent, the same generally percussive delivery, but suddenly filled with terminology that other orcs can't follow, references to engineering concepts that correspond to actual engineering reality, descriptions of component interactions that are functionally accurate, even when the words themselves are orcish translations of concepts that the mechboy has never been formally taught. One documented example has a mechboy explaining to an assistant why a particular integration wasn't working. He described the issue as the outer magnetotransference units sending the internal gyrostabilizers all zoggy, which is nonsense in every sense except the one that matters. When the problem was examined by Imperial tech priests who later captured the device, that is precisely what was wrong with it. The mechboy didn't know the correct technical terminology. He knew the correct technical reality and translated it into his own words. The knowledge is real. The vocabulary is theirs. Then there is the weird boy, and the weird boy deserves to be approached with a particular kind of gentleness, the way you approach something that might explode and whose relationship with conventional reality is somewhat negotiable. All orcs generate a psychic field, the collective resonance we've discussed and will discuss further. But most orcs generate it without being aware of it, in the same way that you breathe without thinking about it. The weird boy is different. The weird boy is sensitive to it, acutely, painfully, uncontrollably sensitive. As more orcs gather, the field grows stronger, and the weird boy feels that growth in very immediate physical terms. It builds behind the eyes. It builds in the skull. It builds until, when the threshold is crossed, it has to go somewhere. The somewhere that it goes is through the weird boy. Erupting as violent, raw, psychic energy, manifesting as bolts of green lightning, gouts of devastating energy, or in some cases, simply an outward explosion of uncontrolled warp force that devastates everything in the immediate vicinity, including, sometimes, the weird boy itself. A weird boy in the middle of a large battle, surrounded by thousands of orcs, all doing what orcs do, is a walking disaster of unpredictable power. A living conduit for psychic energy that has no particular interest in being aimed, controlled, or safely contained. The weird boy's own attitude toward all of this varies considerably. Many weird boys are deeply unhappy about the whole situation and spend whatever time is not dedicated to involuntary psychic explosions trying to stay as far from large gatherings of their species as possible. The problem is that their war boss has noticed what happens when they're put near the enemy, and what happens is useful. There is a rarer and more alarming subtype called the warphead, a weird boy that has stopped dreading the energy surges and started enjoying them. The warphead seeks out battle specifically for the rush of psychic power it produces, using that power with a reckless enthusiasm that makes other orcs nervous. Even by orc standards, an orc that makes other orcs nervous is something worth being careful around. The run-third is the last odd boy worth dwelling on here, though their contribution is less dramatic than the others. The run-third is the specialist in managing the lower orders, the Gretchen, the Snotlings, the various small and disposable members of the orcoid ecosystem who do the work that makes everything else possible. The run-third has the patience, the tools, specifically the grot prod, which is exactly what it sounds like, and the grabber stick, and the specific disposition required to keep these smaller beings organized and pointed in roughly the right direction. It is not glamorous work, but an orc settlement without a good run-third is an orc settlement where the Gretchen have hidden in the ventilation and the Snotlings have eaten something they shouldn't have, and the fungus garden is in a state of creative anarchy. The run-third's contribution is the difference between a functioning warband and a very loud, very smelly collection of individuals going in 17 directions simultaneously. Section 8. The Clans. 6 Paths of Green Identity. An orc's clan, or clan in the orc spelling that maintains itself throughout all dialectal variation, is not simply a social group it belongs to. It is, in a profound and somewhat literal sense, what the orc is. The clans of orc society are not organizations that individuals choose to join or leave in the way humans might join a sports team or a political party. They are cultural identities that emerge from the same deep genetic pre-programming that gives the mech boy his mechanical instinct and the weird boy his sensitivity to the field. An orc doesn't decide to be a goth. It is a goth in the same way that it is green. The disposition, the preferences, the particular flavor of aggression, it's in the spores. There are 6 clans that are widespread enough to be found in virtually every orc tribe anywhere in the galaxy. 6 paths down which an orc's natural inclinations can send it. And while individual orcs from any clan can end up anywhere in orc society, The clans define the cultural texture of a tribe in ways that shape everything from color choices to preferred combat tactics to what kinds of squig are considered appropriate to keep as a pet. The Goths are, if such a distinction can be made in a species entirely devoted to violence, the most devoted to violence. The Goths are the archetype of what you think of when you think of an orc. Massive, bellicose, close combat obsessed, dismissive of anything that smells like subtlety or cleverness. They favor black in their color choices. Their armor is heavy, functional, and shows the marks of every fight its wearer has survived in the way of proudly worn scars. A Goth settlement has a particular atmosphere of low, constant menace, the vibration of a lot of large bodies in close proximity, each one absolutely confident in its own physical supremacy and interested in proving it. The largest war bosses in history have disproportionately been Goths, and the Goths themselves are perfectly aware of this and will tell you about it at length if you don't stop them. The evil sons are the other great cultural expression of orc nature, pointed in a different but equally pure direction. Where the Goths are about the crash and push of close combat, the evil sons are about speed. The roar of an engine, the blur of terrain as it passes, the specific joy of reaching a target so fast that it doesn't have time to prepare, of the explosive moment where maximum velocity meets maximum resistance. The evil sons are vehicle-obsessed in the way that the most devoted racing enthusiasts are vehicle-obsessed, except that their version of the Indianapolis 500 involves considerably more weapons and somewhat looser rules about what constitutes finishing the race. They paint everything red. They paint themselves red. The phrase, "red ones go faster," is not merely an advertising slogan in Evil Sons culture. It is a theological position, and we'll discuss why it's technically correct later. Evil Sons settlements smell like exhaust fumes and burning rubber, and have the constant background sound of engines being revved for no practical reason except the pleasure of the sound. The bad moons are the wealthy orcs, which is a concept that requires immediate clarification because wealthy orc sounds self-contradictory. The bad moons are wealthy because of a specific biological quirk. Their teeth grow faster than those of orcs from any other clan. In the teeth economy, this translates directly to more purchasing power. A bad moon orc, all else being equal, can afford better equipment, more impressive modifications, and more elaborate displays of status than its counterparts from other clans. This has made the bad moons the closest thing the orcs have to a mercantile class. They buy and sell and commission and show off in ways that other clans regard with a mixture of envy and barely concealed contempt. Bad moon settlements have a particular quality of conspicuous display, of weapons covered in extra components that serve no functional purpose but communicate very clearly how many teeth their owner had to spend. The bad moons favor yellow and black, and there is usually a quantity of gold somewhere on a senior bad moon's person. The death skulls are looters. This is not a pejorative, it is a job description, a cultural identity, and a spiritual calling all at once. The death skulls believe, with the genuine conviction of a people who have built a world view around it, that blue paint brings good luck. They paint themselves blue. They paint their equipment blue. They paint things that other orcs don't even think to paint because painting them serves no purpose, and they do it blue. And then they go looking for things to take. The Death Skull's presence in a battle is characterized not just by their participation in the fighting, but by the constant, habitual cataloguing of everything the enemy has that might be worth picking up. They are looting while fighting, noting the positions of fallen enemies and valuable equipment, calculating the logistics of getting good gear from point A, currently on someone who is trying to shoot them, to point B, their own collection. Other clans call them filchers and don't trust them. The Death Skulls regard this reputation with the serene indifference of beings who have enough teeth to not care what anyone thinks. The Blood Axes have the most unusual relationship with the rest of Orc culture of any of the 6 major clans, because the Blood Axes do something no self-respecting Orc should do. They think before hitting. They use tactics. They employ camouflage. They pay attention to the concept of military strategy beyond charge and hit hard. The Blood Axes have been exposed to human military thinking through fighting against humans, studying captured Imperial documents, and apparently through some historical period of unusual interaction with human mercenaries, and they have incorporated elements of it into their approach to war. In Orc terms, this makes them suspect, deeply, profoundly, uncomfortably suspect. Other clans accuse them of being too much like humans. The Blood Axes wear camouflage, which is the clearest sign of all that something has gone wrong somewhere, because a proper Orc shouldn't be hiding from anyone. The Blood Axes would point out that they win more often than the Orcs, who are simply very visible and very loud. The other Orcs would respond that winning isn't the point if you're not doing it correctly, and that correctly means without any of this sneaky business. This argument has been ongoing for millennia and shows no signs of resolution. There's a specific Orc term for what the Blood Axes are accused of, being too much like Umis, and the social weight this accusation carries says something revealing about Orc culture. In a species that defines itself entirely through the celebration of what it is, the worst thing you can be is something you're not. The Goths are proud of being Goths. The evil sons are proud of being evil sons. The Bad Moon's ostentatious display is a form of pride, not insecurity. Even the Death Skulls looting, which other clans dismiss, is something the Death Skulls are completely comfortable with. They're proud thieves, not ashamed ones. But the Blood Axes are being something alien has crept into them, some quality of otherness. And however practical the tactical advantage, however impressive the win rates, this makes the other clans uncomfortable in a way that pure ferocity never could. What's interesting about this discomfort is what it tells us about Orc identity. The Orcs are not a species that defines itself in opposition to others. They don't have the Eldar's proud separatism or humanity's territorial anxiety about influence and contamination. They fight everyone because they love fighting, not because they hate the other. But the Blood Axes have, by incorporating external influences, done something that challenges the basic Orc sense of self. What makes an Orc is not genetics alone. Every Orc has the genetics. It's the purity of the expression, the wholeness of the commitment to being exactly what the biology created. And the Blood Axes, who are trying to be a little bit like something else, are by this logic slightly less completely themselves. Whether this represents a genuine failing or simply a different adaptation is a question that Orcs will fight about rather than resolve. The snakebites are the last of the 6, and the best way to understand them is that they represent the old ways in a species that doesn't have much patience for history. The snakebites are the most primitive of the major clans, deliberately so. They use technology only when they absolutely must, prefer simple and direct methods in all things, and maintain a lifestyle that would be recognizable to whatever passed for a prehistoric Orc when the spores first found soil on some ancient forgotten world. They don't wear power armor if they can wear the hide of something they killed. They don't ride vehicles if they can ride something that was alive before they caught it. They have a higher proportion of weird boys than any other clan, possibly because their more direct connection to the natural Orcoid ecosystem gives them a more natural relationship to the psychic currents that the weird boy channels. Their settlements smell of animal musk and raw vegetation rather than machine oil. They are fierce. They are stubborn. They are, by any assessment, exactly what an Orc was before the mech boy workshops and the vehicle cults got involved, and they are not particularly interested in updating the model. Beyond the 6 major clans, there are other groupings worth mentioning. The freebooters are the Orcs who have broken free of all clan affiliations. Exiles, adventurers, pirates, and those who were ejected from their home clans for various reasons, and decided that the open void was preferable to renegotiating their status. Freebooters tend toward a particularly theatrical version of self-presentation, favouring pirate imagery with large coats, impressive hats, and a competitive enthusiasm for appearing more wealthy and fearsome than their actual circumstances might warrant. They operate in mercenary bands, selling their considerable combat abilities to whoever has enough teeth to be worth fighting for, or simply taking what they want and moving on before anyone can organise a coherent response. Section 9. Gork, Mork, and the Great Green. Orc Spirituality. There comes a point in any serious examination of any culture where you have to talk about what that culture believes. Not what it does, not how it organises itself, but what it holds sacred. What it sees as being behind and underneath all the surface activity, the deep structure of meaning that gives everything else its significance. For the orcs, this is Gork and Mork, the twin gods who are simultaneously very simple and very strange. Let's start with the simple version, because the orcs themselves would prefer it. There are two gods. Gork is brutal but cunning. Mork is cunning but brutal. Orcs argue constantly about which is which, because the distinction is simultaneously obvious and impossible to define. When you ask an orc to explain the difference between a god that is brutal but cunning and a god that is cunning but brutal, you get an answer that involves a lot of pointing and brow furrowing, and eventually either violence or the philosophical equivalent of a shrug. The unofficial translation is this: Gork hits you harder when you can see it coming. Mork hits you harder when you can't. Both are hitting you. The hitting is the constant. The metaphysics is commentary. These are not gods in the way that the Emperor of Mankind is a god, an immense, unique, singular psychic entity maintaining itself through the collective faith of trillions of worshippers. Gork and Mork are something stranger. They are the accumulated psychic resonance of an entire species made conscious in the warp. Every orc that has ever lived, fighting and dying and generating its constant hum of psychic energy, has contributed to the collective pool of orc consciousness that exists in the Imperium. And from that pool, in the same way that the gods of chaos crystallized from the accumulated emotions of other species over vast ages, the twin gods of the orcs condensed into actual entities, beings of genuine warp power that embody everything the orc species is, distilled and magnified to cosmic scale. Gork and Mork are therefore, in a very real sense, portraits of the orcs themselves. Not idealizations of what the orcs want to be, they're already that. They are representations of what the orcs simply are, scaled up to divine proportions. They are crude, they are violent, they are cunning in the specifically orcish way that doesn't quite resemble any other kind of cunning. They are indestructible in the way that an idea is indestructible. You can suppress it, damage it, force it into retreat. But as long as the beings who generated it keep generating it, it keeps coming back. The theological question of whether the gods existed before the orcs, or whether the orcs created them, is one that orcs are perfectly happy to argue about indefinitely. One school of thought, expressed most clearly by the weird boys who have the most direct experience of warp consciousness, holds that Gork and Mork are as old as the orcs themselves, that the gods were present at the first moment of orc life, were perhaps even the template from which the orcs were constructed. Another, articulated in the particular croak of an elderly pain boy named Grotznik, whose surgical adventures have made him somewhat philosophical, holds that the orc beliefs and the collective field of Wa energy created the gods after the fact, building them out of accumulated psychic material, the way a sculptor builds a statue. The orcs that hear both arguments tend to consider them equally interesting, and then go fight about something else. What the orcs don't do, and this is genuinely remarkable when you think about it, is ask their gods for help. The theology of Gork and Mork worship is not intercessionary. The orcs don't pray the way that Imperial citizens pray, with the desperate hope of a miracle from a powerful being. In orc culture, asking the gods for help is considered somewhat embarrassing, almost cowardly. The gods are not there to make things easier for you. They're there to demonstrate what being an orc at maximum intensity looks like, to serve as an image of the best possible version of what you are, an aspiration carved in divine violence and scaled to the size of reality itself. Every greenskin that fights well enough, that lives the orc life with sufficient commitment and ferocity and cunning brutality or brutal cunning, is in some sense walking the path toward the gods, not worshipping from below, but growing toward, becoming more fully what Gork and Mork represent. The practical expression of this theology is the Gargants and the Stompers, vast walking war machines built in what mechboys believe to be the image of the gods, shaped like immense mechanical orcs, armed proportionally. These aren't just weapons, they are sacred objects. The construction of a new Gargant is the product of a kind of divine inspiration, the mechboy receiving a vision from Gork, from Mork, or from whatever part of the collective psychic field expresses itself as creative impulse, and spending months or years building that vision into something that walks and shoots and, most importantly, looks the part. An orc standing in the shadow of a Gargant is standing in the presence of something that embodies their gods. The feeling this produces is not reverence in the human sense, but something closer to a kind of ferocious pride. This is what we are, projected outward until it cracks the sky. After death, the orc believes, the fighting continues. Every greenskin that lived with sufficient brutality and cunning, that died in the way that an orc should die, which is to say, loudly and causing significant problems for whoever was responsible, goes to fight alongside Gork and Mork in whatever war they're currently engaged in. Not rest, not peace, not even reunion with fallen comrades in any sentimental sense. Just more fighting, bigger fighting, the best fighting, in the company of the ultimate fighters, forever. This afterlife is not a consolation prize. For an orc, this is paradise. The concept of orc death itself, in the context of their belief system, is worth examining more carefully. For most of the galaxy's species, death is the thing to be avoided above all else. The ultimate failure condition, the thing that all systems of meaning have to somehow account for and make bearable. The Imperium of mankind has built its entire religious infrastructure around managing the human relationship with death, offering the promise of the Emperor's divine embrace as the reward for a righteous life. The Eldari are so acutely aware of what happens to their souls after death that their entire civilization has been reorganized around avoiding it. The Necrons literally abandoned biological existence to escape death, and what they got was arguably worse. The orcs have none of this. An orc that is killed in battle has not failed. It has graduated. The biggest dishonor in orc culture is not death. Death in combat is the standard outcome for the best possible orc life, but the wrong kind of death. Dying to disease, for instance, which is rare given orc biology, but possible. Dying to an accident before you've had the chance to fight anything. Being killed ignominiously from behind before you had the chance to turn around and make the killers pay for the attempt. These are unfortunate ends. Death in a proper stand-up fight, surrounded by the noise and the press and the chaos of a real engagement? That's not a tragedy. That's the destination the whole journey was always pointed toward. This relationship to mortality has practical battlefield implications that Imperial commanders have had to learn the hard way. An orc does not become cautious as casualties mount. It does not need its leaders to tell it to be brave, because it is not experiencing fear in the way that requires courage to overcome. The option of stop fighting before it kills you simply doesn't compute in the same way. This doesn't make orcs invincible, and it doesn't mean they have no instinct for self-preservation at all. Orcs do run from fights they've clearly lost, because living to fight another day is better than dying without accomplishing anything. But the calculus of when to fight and when to withdraw is not contaminated by the fear of death. It's a purely tactical assessment made by a creature that regards dying in the right circumstances as an acceptable and even honourable outcome. The orc belief in Gork and Mork has one more dimension worth addressing, and that's the question of miraculous intervention. Does this belief produce actual divine aid? The answer, in the 40,000 setting, is genuinely uncertain, but the evidence is suggestive. When an orc warboss of the right personality prays before battle, not desperately, not pleading, but with the casual confidence of someone acknowledging a fellow professional, things sometimes happen that are difficult to explain through mundane cause and effect. Shots that should have been fatal miss. Weapons that should have jammed fire. An enemy that was about to land the killing blow trips on nothing and gives the orc the opening it needed. Whether this is genuinely divine intervention, whether the psychic field is generating effects in response to belief, or whether it's simply the confirmation bias of survivors who remember the times things went right, in the 40,000 universe, this kind of distinction is somewhat academic. The effect is real. The source is a matter of philosophy. Section 10. The Gestalt Field. Belief as Reality. We've touched on the psychic field that orcs generate throughout this exploration, but it deserves its own section because it is, without exaggeration, one of the most extraordinary phenomena in the entire Warhammer setting. It is also the thing that makes the orcs genuinely terrifying in a way that simple physical power alone cannot explain. Here is the straightforward version. All orcs produce a low-level psychic resonance, a kind of background radiation of mental energy that the warp reflects and amplifies. When orcs gather together, these individual fields overlap and combine, producing something greater than the sum of its parts. The more orcs, the stronger the combined field. The happier the orcs, specifically, the more they're doing what they were built to do, which is fighting, the stronger the field. This combined field is what the orcs call the power behind their collective battle cry, and what Imperial scholars more formally call the Orkoid Gestalt psychic phenomenon. And here is what that field does, which is the part that should make you pause and think carefully. It makes orc beliefs real, not metaphorically, literally. If enough orcs believe something is true, the psychic field they collectively generate applies pressure to the fabric of reality until it becomes true. This is not magic in the way that warp-based psychic powers are magic. It is not the individual will of a single powerful mind bending reality through force. It is the collective conviction of an entire species, amplified through a psychic dimension that responds to the weight of belief, gently, persistently, constantly reshaping the physical world to match what the orcs think it should look like. The examples are where this gets interesting. Orc rockets painted yellow create bigger explosions. Not because yellow paint has any chemical properties relevant to explosive yield, but because orcs believe that yellow rockets explode bigger, and there are enough orcs believing this that the field makes it so. An orc vehicle painted red goes faster, not because the paint reduces aerodynamic drag or improves fuel combustion, because the collective orc consciousness has decided with total certainty that red things are faster, and reality has obligingly agreed. The Goths paint their equipment black and white, inspired by memories of the lunar wolves who devastated their ancestors at Ulanor, and those black and white forces hit harder. Because the Goths believe they should. This is also the explanation or rather a major part of the explanation, for why orc technology works at all. A human engineer examining an orc weapon sees something that should not function. The tolerances are wrong. The materials are poorly matched. The construction is imprecise. The power source is jury-rigged in ways that violate several physical laws. By rights, this thing should not shoot a bullet in any direction with any reliability. But an orc picks it up and it roars. Because the orc believes it will roar, and the field responds to that belief, and somewhere in the interaction between belief and physics, the thing works. Give that same weapon to a human, remove the orc that believed in it, and the weapon falls silent. It doesn't understand what it's supposed to do anymore. It can't. The Adeptus Mechanicus, whose own technological tradition is based on the idea that machines function because of the prayers and rituals of properly trained tech priests, who themselves are essentially doing something not entirely unlike what the orcs are doing, just with more robes and much more paperwork, found this deeply unsettling when they first seriously studied it. The notion that technology could be made to function through nothing but collective psychic conviction struck at the foundations of their theological framework. Some Mechanicus scholars concluded that the orcs must secretly have access to some form of machine spirit. Others concluded that the psychic field itself was a form of the Omnissiah's grace made manifest in an alien species. Most concluded that the whole business was heretical and moved on. The weird boys are the acute expression of this field, the creatures who are so sensitive to its fluctuations that they cannot help but channel it directly. For them, the collective field is not a background hum, but a constant presence, growing and swelling and demanding release with every additional orc that joins the gathering. The weird boy is both the most powerful expression of the orcoid psychic field and, in many ways, its most obvious victim. A mind overwhelmed by the constant input of thousands of other minds, forced periodically to release that energy in ways that are spectacular, destructive, and not always predictable. There is a further implication to this field that the most careful thinkers among the Orc Watchers in the Imperium have identified, and it connects back to everything we discussed about the Krork. The strength of the field scales with numbers, with the scale of the conflict, with the intensity of the Orc experience. A galaxy-spanning conflict, with orc populations in the billions engaged in simultaneous planet-killing warfare, would produce a field of psychic intensity that no one in the current era has experienced. And it would do something to the orcs themselves, something physical, something biological. It would start to wake up the dormant growth mechanisms. It would start to accelerate the process that turns ordinary orcs into something larger, faster, smarter, more powerful. It would start to call the Krork back out of whatever evolutionary sleep they've been resting in for 60 million years. The one historical example we have of this process beginning to activate is the War of the Beast, which took place in the 32nd millennium, approximately 1500 years after the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne. During that war, an orc leader of unprecedented power and intelligence emerged, called the Beast by the Imperium, leading forces on a scale that hadn't been seen since the mythological wars of ancient history. The orcs fighting in that conflict were physically larger than modern orcs. Their technology was more sophisticated. Their war boss, the Beast itself, could speak fluent Imperial Gothic, which shocked even Primarch-level warriors who encountered it. The Beast was, by all assessments, something partway between a modern war boss and a Krork, a living demonstration of what the species becomes when wars get large enough to activate the dormant potential. The Beast was eventually defeated at tremendous cost, but the conditions that produced it, a large enough war, a powerful enough leader, a field strong enough, have not gone away. They are simply waiting to be recreated. And the 41st millennium, with its cascading crises and fracturing reality, is precisely the kind of environment in which those conditions might eventually be met again. This is the specific thing that makes senior Imperial strategists wake up in cold sweats. Not the orc horde on the horizon, which can be fought. The potential of what that horde might become, given the right circumstances, is the thing that has no conventional military response. The Great Rift, the massive tear in the fabric of reality that opened around 999 M41, is called Gork's Grin by the orcs, who regard it not as a catastrophe but as an opportunity. The tides of chaos flowing through it, the disruption to every other civilization in the galaxy, the sheer scale of the violence that has followed. This is, from an orc perspective, precisely the kind of environment in which the field gets stronger. The kind of environment in which wars get big enough to be interesting. The orcs are, by all accounts, absolutely thriving. Section 11. The Great Crusade of Violence, when the warband rises. Everything we've discussed, the biology, the society, the economy, the theology, the psychic field, comes together at the moment that matters most in orc culture. The moment when a warband stops being a collection of individuals brawling in a settlement and becomes something more. The moment it begins to move. This is what the orcs call the beginning of a great crusade of violence, what the Imperium calls a massive warband mobilization, and what the orcs themselves, in their collective battle cry, name with that one encompassing, everything meaning sound. We're not using that word here by design, but you know what it means. It means everything is about to get much louder. How does it start? Almost always the same way. A warboss wins a fight, a particularly impressive fight, or a series of fights, or a single legendary confrontation that spreads through the settlement, and then through the next settlement, and then through the next, carried by the mouths of Gretchen messengers and the instinctive psychic awareness that all orcs have of large events in their vicinity. Something big happened over there. Someone very large beat something very difficult in an impressive way. Every orc within hearing distance, which, as the field amplifies, becomes a very large distance indeed, feels a pull. Not a command, not an order, a pull, like gravity, towards something that promises the maximum possible amount of the thing they were built for. The warboss that started this process begins to grow, physically. The victories accumulate, the field strengthens, the biological machinery that was dormant activates. An orc that was already the largest in its tribe starts to exceed that category. Its knobs, the elite warriors who serve as officers and enforcers, grow as well, though more slowly. The whole tribe is touched by the escalating field. Weapons get bigger, vehicles get more elaborate. The mech boys, energized by the growing psychic current flowing through the gathered orcs, start producing devices of increasing complexity and ambition. Projects that would never have occurred to them in a quiet period suddenly seem not just possible, but necessary. Other warbands hear, other warbosses feel the pull. And here is where the orc political system does something fascinating. Those other warbosses have a choice. They can submit to the rising leader, add their warband to the growing horde, and fight under a banner not entirely their own, gaining the benefits of the growing field and the larger conflict while accepting a reduction in personal status. Or they can challenge the warboss directly, attempt to unseat them through single combat, or through the accumulation of enough followers to make the challenge credible by weight of numbers. Most of the challenges fail. The warboss that started this process is growing because they keep winning, and an orc that challenges a warboss mid-escalation is trying to beat something that is actively getting harder to beat as the seconds pass. But some succeed, and the orc that defeats the rising warboss inherits everything. The followers, the growing field, the momentum, and the process continues, if anything faster. As the warband grows towards something that can legitimately be called a horde, the composition of the force changes. The vehicle cults come out in numbers. The speed freaks, who live for the moment when the order to advance, becomes an excuse to drive as fast as possible in the direction of the enemy. The Storm Boys, who strap crude rockets to their backs and launch themselves at enemy positions in what amounts to unguided missile attacks, driven by a specific, somewhat formal aesthetic of violence that involves lots of precision and very sharp boots. The Flashgits, who have so many teeth that they can afford weapons of genuinely absurd power and complexity, and who join large battles because a large battle is the only stage big enough for the display they want to put on. The Beast Snagger Boys, who ride creatures instead of machines and have a particular enthusiasm for bringing down the largest enemies they can find, preferably vehicles and war engines. The battlefield on which this force eventually arrives is not a quiet place. The noise alone is a weapon, the accumulated roar of thousands of engines, the bellowing of thousands of voices, the sound of steel on steel, and the crack of weapons fired with aggressive confidence in volumes that few forces in the galaxy can match. The sight is equally overwhelming, a green flood churning forward across terrain that is theoretically an obstacle and practically an irrelevance. Each individual a problem, and the collective something closer to a force of nature. The enemy, whoever the enemy happens to be, and the orcs are, it must be said, not particularly selective, is faced not just with the physical reality of all those bodies and all those weapons, but with the psychic pressure of the field. Even non-psychically sensitive species can feel it. A wrongness in the air, a weight, a sense of something very large and very old, and completely indifferent to the question of your survival, pressing in from everywhere at once. The battle itself, when it's joined, has a quality that experienced orc opponents have attempted to describe, and that typically collapses into incoherence. It is not the ordered, structured, tactically nuanced engagement of, say, Space Marine doctrine. It is not even the numbers-based grinding advance of an Imperial Guard offensive. It is something more like a weather event with opinions. Pockets of intense, personal, savage fighting everywhere simultaneously. Vehicles screaming past at speeds that are frankly irresponsible. Weird boys erupting in green fire at random intervals. Mech boys charging toward broken enemy vehicles with the specific gleam in their eye that indicates they've already decided what they're going to do with the parts. The Gretchen, driven out of their preferred hiding places by the momentum of the advance, scurrying forward in overwhelming numbers, doing surprisingly serious damage simply because there are so many of them that probability eventually delivers some of them onto targets. And at the center of it all, the war boss, possibly now standing 4 meters tall and still growing, laughing in a register that vibrates in your chest before it reaches your ears, conducting this symphony of violence with a power claw the size of a small car. After the battle, win or lose, the orcs do something that is sometimes more terrifying than the battle itself. They begin to settle. The spores that have been released by every injury, every exertion, every death in the fighting are now in the soil, in the water, in the air, in the cracks of the ruined buildings, the crater walls, the scorched earth. A world that has experienced an orc warband will see orc life emerging from the wilderness years later, sometimes decades later, in the form of feral tribes, new settlements, new warbands. You cannot fumigate an orc infestation. You cannot make a world safe by killing the orcs that are currently on it. The soil remembers. The spores wait. And eventually, when conditions are right, when enough biological material has accumulated in the underground fungal networks, something pushes up through the earth again, blinks in the light, and reaches for the nearest available weapon. The specific mechanics of how an orc warband sustains itself during a campaign are worth exploring because they differ fundamentally from how any other military force in the setting operates. Human armies require supply lines, food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, replacement parts, All of it must flow from established production centers to the front, through logistics chains that are vulnerable to disruption and that represent one of the primary targets of enemy action. The death of a supply line is often the death of the army it feeds. Orc warbands have supply lines, but they are not vulnerable in the same way, for the simple reason that the primary source of supplies is the battlefield itself. The Death Skulls strip every fallen enemy and every piece of destroyed equipment before the smoke has cleared. The mech boys repurpose the salvage into new components, replacement parts, entirely new weapons. The snotlings who inevitably accompany any large orc force have already begun cultivating the local fungal growth, establishing new food gardens in whatever soil is available. The squigs breed in the settlement areas that spring up almost immediately after a force makes camp, providing a renewable food source that requires no transportation. The orc warband is less an army that consumes fixed supplies than an organism that metabolizes its environment as it moves through it. This metabolic relationship with the landscape has a side effect that many Imperial planners have not fully appreciated. The devastation of an orc invasion is not solely the physical destruction wrought by weapons and vehicles. It is also the transformation of the environment itself. The orcoid ecosystem, once established, changes the soil chemistry, the local fauna, the distribution of fungal species, in ways that are difficult to reverse. A world that has hosted a major orc presence for years or decades is, in the most literal ecological sense, no longer quite what it was. The orcoid ecosystem has taken root. It will, left alone, continue to develop. And the next orc uprising on that world, decades or centuries later, will have the advantage of growing in soil that already knows them. The question of what happens to the warband after a decisive defeat, when the war boss has been killed and the horde has broken apart, is one of the most strategically important in any campaign against the orcs, and the answer is both comforting and alarming in equal measure. The comforting part is that a large orc force without a dominant leader does fragment. The coherence that the war boss's presence and the strength of the field around them provided dissolves, and the constituent warbands revert to the normal state of orc politics, which involves fighting each other at least as enthusiastically as fighting anyone else. The immediate threat is neutralized. The alarming part is what happens in the medium term. The surviving orcs, scattered across the affected region, continue to fight. Smaller battles, local skirmishes, the persistent low-level violence that orcs engage in as a default. And as they fight, the field strengthens. And as the field strengthens, the individuals grow. And somewhere in the population of survivors, sooner or later, one of them grows enough that the others start deferring to it. And the process begins again, not from zero, from a population of hardened veterans who have already survived one major campaign and who carry its lessons in their biology. This is why the Imperium has never managed to permanently solve its orc problem. Not because its armies are insufficient, though they often are, because the solution to the orc problem requires eliminating not just the current army, but the entire ecosystem, down to the last spore in the deepest soil, across every world and system and ship that the orcs have ever touched. And the galaxy is very old, and the orcs have been very busy, and there is not enough promethium in the Imperium to burn all of it. This is why the Imperium, which has been fighting orcs for 10,000 years, has never won that fight in any permanent sense. Not because it lacks the military capacity to defeat orc armies. It sometimes manages that, with great effort and significant sacrifice. But because defeating the army is not the same as defeating the species. The species is in the ground. The species is in the spores, on the hull of every ship that was in the vicinity when something large and orky died. The species is patient, in ways that its individual members are absolutely not. The species will outlast every campaign, every purging, every strategic effort to eliminate it. The orcs were built for a 60-million-year war. They have never stopped fighting it. They never will. Section 12. The Eternal Cycle. What it means to be an orc. Pull back now. Take the long view. Step away from the individual orc, the youth that just pushed out of the earth, the boy that just earned its first decent weapon, the knob measuring itself against its war boss in the eternal low-level negotiation of orc hierarchy. And look at what all of it adds up to. An orc is a being that was specifically designed, by intelligence greater than anything operating in the current age, to fight. Not as one task among many, not as a vocation or a calling or a choice, as the entire architecture of its existence. Every cell, every instinct, every social mechanism, every aspect of its biology and psychology, all of it points the same direction. And the remarkable, somewhat vertiginous thing is that an orc knows this. Not in the way that a human might know their deepest nature after years of reflection. An orc knows it the way a hammer knows what it's for. There is no gap between the tool and its purpose. There is no existential crisis in the orc psyche, no searching question about meaning or direction or what life is supposed to be. The orc is entirely, perfectly, contentedly what it is. This is not presented as a compliment necessarily, or as a criticism. It is a description. An orc doesn't lie awake at night, worrying about whether the life it is living is the right one, whether it has wasted its potential, whether the choices it has made have been wise. The orc sleeps well, loudly and in positions that suggest complete structural indifference to the comfort of those around it, but well. And it wakes ready. There is something in that, if you're willing to look at it directly. In a universe as relentlessly bleak as the 41st millennium, as saturated with horror and suffering and civilizational decline as every corner of the Warhammer setting, a universe where the Imperium of mankind struggles under the weight of a religion built around a god who may or may not be alive, where the Eldar carry the knowledge that their civilization caused the birth of a chaos god and are still paying for it, where the Necrons woke up from 60 million years of dormancy to find the universe has moved on without them and their tomb world logistics are a nightmare. In this context, the orc is something genuinely unusual. It is a being that loves what it does, a creature in complete alignment with its purpose, a species that faces the grinding darkness of the far future and responds sincerely with a grin. This is not naivety. The orc knows the universe is violent and dangerous. It doesn't face that knowledge with denial or repression or the construction of elaborate belief systems to make the darkness less dark. It faces it with enthusiasm. The universe is violent and dangerous? Excellent. The orc has been specifically built for a violent and dangerous universe. Bring it forward. Bring it in whatever quantities you have. The orc is ready, has always been ready, will always be ready. There is something in the science of it too that carries weight. These beings, in their current diminished form, are a species holding a potential they have not yet fully expressed. The Krork stirs beneath the surface of every orc alive, dormant but present, waiting for the war that is large enough to wake it. The Old Ones built something that was supposed to be the answer to the hardest problem the galaxy had ever faced. Not a solution, exactly, but an escalation that matched the enemy's escalation. A weapon that grew more powerful the more it was needed. And they built it to last. 60 million years later, that mechanism still ticks, still waits. The galaxy is, by the assessment of most who observe it, getting worse, more chaotic, more violent, more extreme in every direction simultaneously. The Great Rift has fractured reality itself. New horrors emerge from the wound in space that Gork's grin opens wider by the day. The enemies press from all sides, and the Imperium, ancient and struggling, fights on with the desperate momentum of a civilization that has forgotten what it was building toward, but has not yet stopped building. And the orcs look at all of this, and they laugh. They laugh because this is it. This is the environment they were made for. The larger the chaos, the bigger the field. The bigger the field, the faster they grow. The faster they grow, the more they draw others toward them, adding to the field, accelerating the growth. The spiral upward or downward, depending on your perspective. The cascade that leads from a handful of orcs brawling in a settlement to a horde that fills the horizon. From a horde to a host that covers a continent. From a host to something that the ancient records speak of in terms usually reserved for geological events. An orc lives hard and bright and loud. It is born from the earth, grows by fighting, builds through craft and violence in equal measure, worships gods that are mirrors of itself, scaled to cosmic size, dies in the only way worth dying, and seeds the ground for those who come after. It has no literature, no art in any human sense, no philosophy written in books, because books are not something an orc finds useful when what you need to communicate, you communicate with the volume of your voice and the size of your fist. But it has culture, it has identity, it has meaning, in its own terms, that is as complete and as coherent as any the galaxy has produced. And somewhere in the deep substrate of everything it is, in the encoded genetic memory of 60 million years, and the accumulated resonance of every orc that has ever lived and died, and released its spores into alien soil, somewhere in the Great Green, as the Weird Boys call it, Gork and Mork are waiting too. For the war that is worthy of what they made. For the battlefield large enough to wake what sleeps. In the grim darkness of the far future, the green tide never really stops. It pulls back, it seeds the ground. It waits in the earth in a million spores for the right conditions. And then it rises again, louder than before, angrier, larger, and absolutely convinced, as only something built to win can be convinced, that this time the fight will be everything it was promised. That's everything we have time for today, but we've only scratched the surface of what there is to say about these remarkable, strange, magnificently absurd creatures. There are whole stories we haven't told, the specific campaigns, the legendary war bosses whose names carry whole centuries of blood, the peculiar tragedy and comedy of the Gretchen experience, the philosophy of speed freaks who have so fully surrendered to velocity that they no longer quite live except at maximum throttle. There are threads here we could pull for dozens of hours more. If you found something in today's exploration that moved you or fascinated you, or just made you want to sit with it a little longer, please let me know in the comments. I read everything, and the specific questions and observations you leave are a genuine part of how these scripts get built. If you're new here, and the way this channel approaches lore is your kind of thing, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs nothing except the choice to have more of this in your life, which seems like a reasonable trade. Take care of yourselves, and the next time you hear something that sounds like a building-sized engine firing up in the direction of something it definitely shouldn't be approaching at that speed, painted red, driven by something enormous and green and grinning from ear to ear, well, you know what that means. You know what it's been doing all its life to get to this moment. And you know, looking at that grin, that it wouldn't have it any other way. Until next time.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.